Thank you so much, John. Oh, here's the book. So this is not exactly the beginning, but it's just inside the beginning. September 1983. Justine walked across the sloping avenue that bisected the campus. It was a cloudless day and a breeze rustled through the maples. Her parents were firm believers in public education, and in theory, she was too. But the day after her friend Raoul overdosed on heroin in the boys' bathroom, she'd called Griswold and requested an application. An envelope arrived a week later enclosing a glossy brochure. The cover bore a coat of arms with the school's motto, Incipit Vita Nova, which Cressida proudly translated as, "Here begins new life." Reading the course catalog, Justine felt a thrill of possibility. An entire semester on Faulkner, another on Emily Dickinson. She was accepted with a full scholarship. At home, heated discussion ensued. Justine worried about keeping up with the wealthy kids. She wasn't concerned about the boys. Boys were something she did well. But the money. She barely had enough to buy a soda. But all her parents could fret about was their daughter being corrupted by privilege. In the end, despite her parents' misgivings and her own, Justine enrolled. An old friend from New Haven, who had gone to Griswold, had described townies roaring through in Camaros, chucking flaming beer cans and screaming, "Gas the geeks!" The pristine campus was indeed a sharp contrast with Wormley, the sorrowful town that surrounded it. Justine didn't blame the townies for resenting this idyllic world. She walked along lush playing fields, the white goalposts gleaming against the cerulean sky. Around the back of a brick athletic building were trash cans and discarded athletic gear. Next to this was a sandy patch with a few wooden benches and airport-style ashtrays. She saw a boy in a long trench coat, boombox on his shoulder, swaying like a cobra. Another boy, a jock, balanced a girl on his lap who was blowing smoke rings. Down the bench sat a girl with lanky legs stretched out in the dirt. Calculatedly sloppy, Justine thought, but everything she wore, from the soft leather of her jacket to the polished toe of her combat boots, looked expensive. Was Justine the only scholarship student here? "Do you have a light?" Justine asked her. The girl looked up from under a tangle of dark hair and chucked matches at Justine, who just managed to catch them. "What's the cat club?" Justine asked, looking at the matchbook. "Nightclub in the city, AKA the litter box." The girl pulled a package of tobacco from her motorcycle jacket. Placing a pinch in the crease of a rolling paper, she fashioned a cigarette that looked like a joint. Her fingernails were painted cobalt blue. Justine glanced back at the blonde jock, admiring the sharp arc of his cheekbone and the curve of his lats, visible through his t-shirt in all their masculine glory. The girl leaned toward Justine. "Bruce Underwood," she whispered, "and yeah, he's a hunk of burning love." Clearly, she needed to be much less obvious when interested in a boy. "I'm Justine Rubin." "Aha! Fellow member of the tribe. I'm Eve Strauss." Eve made quote marks with her fingers. "Diversity." Thank you.
Okay, Amanda. That was great. So welcome, everyone, wherever you are. It's great to have everybody here. Congratulations, Amanda. Today's the publishing day, right? So
yeah.
If I had fireworks, I'd be setting them off. Amanda, you've told me fairly recently, to my surprise, that the germ of the idea for this novel was a conversation that you and I had like a dozen years ago.
Yeah, so you and Steve, you and your wife were over for supper, and as parents, you and I were reflecting on, God, can you believe the way it used to be and how crazy those parents were? And, being parents ourselves, we were sort of shocked. And then we started telling generally unsavory anecdotes about things that happened in the past. And all of a sudden this light bulb went off and I thought, I'm writing that story. So I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight.
Yeah, I guess that's why I'm here, but I mean, so talk a little more about the genesis of the project, because you hadn't, as far as I know, you hadn't written before, and I think it was this notion that somehow stuck in your craw and became something that you had to work out through writing, and you took on the project of writing a novel. I don't know if it started out as a novel. Just tell me about the evolution of the whole thing.
You're right. I was not a writer, and it took me a long time to become a writer. But initially, I thought of interviewing people and doing it in a sort of oral history fashion. And of course, I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to right away. So I contacted them. I said, "Can you talk to me? I'm doing this project. I don't exactly know what it is. I'm putting it together." And as you and I talked about before, you'd be shocked at how willing people are to talk about themselves and tell all kinds of things that. So I took full advantage of TMI and sometimes recorded them with their knowledge. And pretty soon I came to realize that I really wanted this to be a novel. I wanted the creative latitude, I guess, to tell the story that I wanted to tell, and tell the story in a way that you and I were talking about, but in my own way and in a way that wasn't forced to hew to the truth.
It's obviously autobiographical. Is it okay for me to say that?
What do you mean?
I mean, I think there's a character in the novel, for those of you who have not read it, named Eve Strauss. I believe your name is Strauss. So how much of Eve is you, and how much of you is an Eve, and how did they sort of become one or separate from each other?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, Eve was the only character in the initial stages that I really knew, but I came to understand and learn who the other characters were on the page as I was working them out, because one of the reasons I wrote this book was a quest to sort of understand what had happened to various people in my life. And I came, and then as characters, there was no longer they were themselves. The characters began to take on a life of their own. And even Eve, who very initially was based on me, became somebody that I really am not or was not.
Do you like Eve more than yourself?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. That's good. So tell me about the others then. How did you develop these characters? How many of them are based on one person? How many of them are sort of composites?
It seems like
you don't have to answer that, but
well, it seems like a lot of them initially were based on people that I know, but as I was saying, I mean, most of them are invented, but they are in some ways combinations of other people that I've known in my life. I mean, they're all woven in from, Clay is a combination of, I don't even want to say, but, a high school boyfriend and, a couple other guys that I had crushes on, and, so like that.
Have you gotten any blowback from any of these? Have you heard anything?
Actually, no. I mean, the only person that sort of saw themselves in the novel was thrilled to see themselves in the novel, and actually saw themselves in the novel more than they are even in the novel at all.
Right.
I like to project, I think, and I think that's mostly been exciting for them.
There's a character in the novel. I mean, there's some difficult characters in the novel, but there's one named Bruce, and Bruce is a pretty vile dude. If you haven't read it, if you have, I'm sure you agree. So I mean, there's always a Bruce, in life. There's always that sort of caddish boy, but this Bruce seemed particularly vile specimen. Is there a Bruce? Is there a real Bruce anywhere?
There are many real Bruces. But I think that Bruce was sort of symbolic in Justine's journey. She had to have this crush on this gorgeous, vile dude in order to see the value, although Clay is very flawed, in Clay. Mm-hmm. So she sort of made that mistake and went for the hot, nasty jock. Ended up with the sweeter, kinder, more sensitive boy. But no, there are many a Bruce in this world, unfortunately, but he's not a real person, thank goodness. I never knew him.
So I think what drew you to the material in the first place, and this idea, and the seed of the discussion we were having, we were talking about the 80s, the early 80s, which had a particular sort of, pheromone to it, which now seems, I said this to you the other day, the past is a foreign country. And I think the early 80s now seem very foreign. And I was trying to think, what it was about the adults and the way that they treated the kids or didn't treat the kids. I mean, there weren't any helicopter parents really back then. It was, maybe there were hot tub parents. The adults were neglectful. They were going through their own crap. Some were predatory, others without the tools to provide any emotional, comfort for their kids. People got married young. They didn't belong together. There was a sort of wreckage from the 60s that sort of really played out in the early 80s when, people that were gay finally sort of came to terms with that fact, or people sort of went off the deep end with the drugs. And that's all in the novel. So, what do you make of that era compared to our own, for example? And
it's such a complicated question because, I had pretty conservative parents in terms of what they allowed me to do. And it drove me absolutely up the wall. I mean, it was terrible for me. And in retrospect, it was the best possible thing for me. So I was hideously jealous of these friends of mine that, could have their apartments to themselves on the weekends while their parents went away, and they had these parties, and I had to be home at God knows what early hour. And so there was a big swath of parenting back then, and as there is today. But, I was talking to another friend of ours, and she maintains that the parenting then was better than it is today, because then, they let us live our own lives. And I think to a certain extent that was mostly purposeful on their part. I mean, they did not feel that they had to be in our business all the time, and they didn't want us in theirs either. And there's something incredibly healthy about that. When you look through the lens of, when you look into a foreign country, it seems fantastic. But
that's sort of that's a survivor talking, though, right? I mean,
I think
there's a lot of wreckage.
I think that's a good point, actually. But she also continued to say that the kids today are so overparented that they're incapable of, making their way on their own. So every generation has some terrible thing that it, wields on its that it inflicts on its children. That the following, we can all start making up what we've done to our children that as parents they're going to try to undo. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can just start a list, but
they fuck you up, your mom and dad. Yeah,
they don't mean to.
They don't mean to, but. Yeah, because I would imagine that the things that the kids in the novel get up to would not necessarily be something you would want your kids to do. I would say the same for the things that I may have done in the early 80s, mid 80s. And yet I look back on them somewhat fondly. Again, that's a survivor talking. Do you feel that way? I mean, we don't want to necessarily get into a parenting conversation.
Well, so anyway, yes. So, when I have two daughters, and one is 19, one is 16. And when my first daughter was born, my mother said, "This is Nana's revenge."
Right.
And as it turns out, it's completely not true. I'm sorry to say, from my mother, who I think is here tonight, she's so good. And so is my younger daughter. And I told someone recently, I think they're pathologically well behaved. So I'm incredibly grateful that I didn't have me as a teenager, but it sort of feels like I kind of missed out on fixing that in some way. I don't know. But
you had the tools from your
I was all ready for it, but it didn't happen. So yeah, I think to a certain degree, your children are, they come out the way they come out, and some of it is nature and some of it is nurture.
So when you look back on these things in the creative process, as you were turning this raw material into fiction and into art, into an invented world, how much of your experience of the past was born of nostalgia? How much, as it was sort of re-remembered, was it re-remembered fondly, or on reconsideration, was it kind of horrible, mortifying?
So
did your opinion of it change as you engaged with it as material?
yes. So in the beginning, when I first started the project, my attitude was horrible things were done by these parents to these children. And I want to understand why that happened and let me investigate that. And in some cases, that attitude remained. But as I interviewed both the kids, I interviewed kids and kids being people our age and parents. And what I learned was that they did this on purpose. I mean, this was not neglect in many of the cases. It was just this clear decision that this is what they thought would be the best way to parent.
Who's that?
Hi, Sarah.
Someone's taking over. I mean, the most obvious example, and it is an elephant in the room, you know, and it's also it's baked into the title of the novel, is the seduction of teenage girls by older men, which occurs repeatedly in the novel. Older men, 15-year-old girls, 16-year-old girls. So seduction is one word. I think today we might call it rape. So how did you handle that as a writer, you know, as opposed to as a person in the time? You know, how did you contend with it? How did you want to present it? And how do you think about it now that it's out in the world?
So I inhabited these characters. I put myself in the mindset of a teenage girl and the way I was. And I was, like many of us, so frustrated by the boys our age. I mean, they were such losers. So
Man.
And no offense, Nick. But I'm sure you weren't, but I met you a little later. I think many of these girls, including myself, we were intrigued by older men. I mean, older men were making themselves available to us from time to time. And, you know, first of all, it was flattering. And second of all, it didn't occur to me back then to think, okay, wait, he's so much older than I am. Why is he doing this? I was like, of course he thinks I'm hot. I am hot. You know, it's sort of that kind of, and it was natural to me that I should get his attention. So, you know, that's how these things happened. I mean, it wasn't because necessarily, and especially it's very important that in Age of Consent, all three of the girls want these relationships. So whether or not those relationships are appropriate or not is for the reader to decide. Those characters are willing participants in those relationships. I mean, the party scene, no spoilers, with Bruce, who's Justine's own age, is a lot worse than, in a way, than what else happens.
Right.
And I don't know, I mean, none of those things actually that happened in the novel actually happened in real life. So I don't know how, you know, there've been other books written about people who are reflecting back on their love affairs with older men and how they feel about it. And I think that there's a big mix out there, and it's not one thing or another.
I mean, it's a pretty intense time for this material to be. I mean, not that it hasn't always been thus throughout history, but because there's sort of this is a time of reckoning. You know, the era of Epstein, which of course is merely is to say it's the era of finding out about Epstein. It's sort of the era of Epstein has been all of history in some ways, but this may be where I have to mention that parts of this novel came up during the trial of Harvey Weinstein. I don't know how many know this. Yeah, well,
yes,
I'm a journalist, Amanda.
I know. You know, I was a judge on the trial, and you know that I can't talk about the trial.
Right, you can't talk about the trial.
I guess it did come up, and it did come up.
I guess I'm mentioning this mostly as a service to our listeners and the people in the audience, wherever they are.
Well, there's a ton of stuff out there for them to read about that, and
yes.
I'll just say that I think that I, as a writer, really wrote about these episodes between young girls and older men in a very straightforward fashion, and I represented those relationships the way that the girls saw them at the time. And
Right.
that's it.
Well, it's very interesting to see it from in that context, because in this time,
It is.
and to see it from the interior life of the teenagers, as opposed to the eyes of the world.
Well, it's one thing I think is interesting to add to that is that in one case, one of the girls has an affair with her father's business partner.
Right.
And the mother is thrilled because she's so glad that her daughter has an accomplished and knowledgeable man as a lover rather than some pimply faced boy, as she deems it. Right. So I think that the reader can make their own judgment about what they think about that.
It's very worldly, Amanda, very worldly. So these kids in the novel are what we would now call privileged, right? They have this maybe we call it, I don't remember if that word was one that was deployed back in the day not as often as it is now, but
I think we just said rich.
Yeah, spoiled, whatever. I mean, that was just it was just there. It's always been there. So I mean, it's sort of that there's a kind of bleary, world weary, kind of spoiled vibe in some of these kids. At times it can be hard to take. As when I'm reading it, I find they're obnoxious, or sometimes I feel implicated. Sometimes whatever it is. So
very
how did
complicated for you?
Yeah, it's very complicated. I wondered how you contended with that, especially in this moment, as the culture has sort of grown more attuned to that, and perhaps has a keener eye for it. Was that something that you worried about, or felt that was sort of a good thing to work with?
Well, I didn't really think about it I didn't frame it in that way, because in the novel, Justine is, and everyone is privileged, let's be clear here, but Justine is from a middle-class background and is a scholarship student and is really worried about money, and as are her parents. And I just wanted to show the sort of culture shock that she felt with everyone being wealthy, and contrast that with the culture shock that Eve, who is from a wealthy family, felt being sort of wearing black and being punk and arriving in this kind of Connecticut preppy boarding school. So, there is financial culture shock and sort of just general culture shock. And then also there is this fact that they're both Jewish and that they feel like outsiders as a result. In terms of the privilege, I mean, I wrote about something that I experienced myself growing up, and certainly privilege was a big part of our world. And it was, I think, maybe something that we were as children much less aware of than I think our kids are. It wasn't talked about as much, and you didn't understand why so-and-so's apartment was small. Nobody said, oh, because, I mean, it wasn't in the dialogue, which is terrible to think about, but now it is. And I think it's difficult to write about wealthy, spoiled kids and get into their psyches and understand their struggles and have empathy. So
it reminded me a little bit of reading Less Than Zero, which I read when I was the age of the characters in your novel, right? And it just come out, and that had this sort of nihilistic chill in it. It was sort of cold at the heart. And then the first half of the novel is about a prep school experience. It's about going to prep school, and that reminded me of the sort of that genre of the prep school novel, which weirdly, when people go to prep school, they're asked to read novel about prep school. I think it's just a trick to try to get them to be interested. But, you know, Catcher in the Rye, separate piece, and so on. Did you, when you were writing about that world, were books like that part of did they give you a framework for this? Were they part of your thinking, or?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question. There are very few books about the female experience in school. And I think, you know, Curtis Sittenfeld's Prep is probably one of the only ones that I know of. I'm sure there are others. I haven't found anything that's really as sort of poignant as that. And also the female experience with sex and boys and culture shock and class. And she does sort of grapple with those ideas. Catcher in the Rye, I mean, I sort of make fun of Catcher in the Rye in a way in my novel, you know, because when I did get to boarding school, our English teacher assigned Catcher in the Rye, and I was like, oh, come on, like, don't insult us. We've all read it. Well, first of all, we've all read it, which is obviously not true. I thought that was the truth, but I also felt honestly insulted that the teacher would try to communicate with us in that way. I mean, I just felt that it was to categorize us as, you know, teenagers that couldn't relate to adults in any other way. And that was the sort of thread between us. And I found that specious.
They're still teaching it everywhere. And it seems even, you know, the connection is even more tenuous to the actual lives of teenagers.
Right. But there's not that many. I mean, there's, you know, there are now some really wonderful sort of coming of age novels. Right. You know, Colson Whitehead wrote a fantastic one. David Mitchell wrote a great, I mean, there are so many better ones, and that also more diverse books that could be read.
Right.
But
well,
parenting, curriculum.
Yeah, we'll fix it all while we're here in quarantine. I think I might have sent you this. There was recently an oral history of Bennington. I think it was in Esquire.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of sort of similar era. So the kids were, you know, 4 years older than the protagonists in your novel. But it was the same time as the early 80s. Similar music, similar tension, sexual tension. You know, Bennington College, Bret Easton Ellis, Donna Tartt, Jonathan Latham. This thing has sort of a similar pheromone to that.
Well, I think there's this kind of idea, I think there's a fascination, and one of the reasons Secret History is so incredible is this fascination of what happens in these elite institutions behind closed doors, and how in some ways the rules of normal society don't apply. And so in a way, I think people can live out a different kind of a fantasy. And I think in Age of Consent, you know, one of the predatory teacher, you know, he's at the school in order to be a predator, in addition to, you know, well, we're not going back to that, but it is this kind of idea of this, you know, sealed world in which teachers and students interact in this other way.
I went to a boarding school, and some of my favorite teachers turned out to be predators. And I mean, you know, it's not just one. I mean, there's more than a half a dozen.
Idols.
And they weren't exactly, you know, I guess it was a game of manipulation. You know, and I think it went both ways, like weird, emotional, mutually assured destruction game that was going on. So the school is, I can't remember what it's called in the novel suddenly. Griswold. It's Choate, right?
It's very thinly disguised.
Which I think in those days when you went there had just been a huge cocaine bust.
It's the year after me.
It was the year after you. Oh, I thought it was before. It was known as Coke Rosemary Hall.
It was probably known as that before, even without the Coke bust.
So was that, I mean, if that happened after you left?
Yeah, but all of my friends were involved. I mean, really? I knew all the people involved.
Did that make the front page of the Times? I can't remember. Anyway, Was getting kicked out like a badge of honor for you, or was it?
No, it was terrible, honestly.
Terrible?
But I didn't get kicked out for drugs. Well, do you want to talk about why I got kicked out of boarding school?
Well, in the novel, the character gets kicked out for going to a David Bowie concert at Toad.
Yeah, well, so
Toad
Toad's Place is
Toad's Place, yeah.
tiny,
Yeah.
well, small theater in New Haven. I actually got kicked out for going to a U2 concert in a small theater in New Haven. And there were a bunch of course, I was 15 years old. The teachers were, several of them right out of college, 22, 23. To me, they could have been 50. I couldn't imagine that they would be at a concert. There they were. Out I went.
Right. And then back to New York.
It was not a badge of honor, but, you know, in retrospect, it could have been a lot worse. I had a soft landing, mostly.
Do you wish it had been a David Bowie concert?
Oh, yes. It would have been so much cool. I wish David Bowie had played at Toad's. That's what I wish.
He didn't. Right.
No, it's made up.
I remember the tour. Anyway.
As do I.
So another book that this brought to mind, and again, I have no idea what resources you brought to it, but I know you're a big reader. I don't know what your inspirations, what your models were, but what I think of one of the things I thought of when I read this was the Preppy Handbook, which came out around then, and which people remember it differently. They think of it in different ways. But it was this weird thing at the time. It was both a how-to guidebook for certain people, and it was also a brilliant piece of satire, wicked sociology of WASP traditions and behaviors. I mean, I kind of remember reading it as both, but
I loved it.
I mean, it painted the picture of the school that you went to and the world that you found yourself in, and the world that these people in your novel find themselves in. And in some ways, I think it described that world, but it almost in the same way that like The Godfather and mafia movies made the mafia more like the movies. I have a feeling that the Preppy Handbook actually made these places more like the Preppy Handbook than they were even before.
So I remember one day in chemistry class looking at this boy who was straining to be preppy at every possible opportunity. And he was wearing this thick, heavy, scratchy wool sweater with nothing underneath. And he was itching underneath himself when nobody was looking so badly. And I was sitting right behind him, and I could see that he was like clawing himself raw because he was so desperate to have this look, and he was miserable. And I just remember thinking to myself, I mean, in New York City, we didn't really have people striving to emulate the Preppy Handbook. People did understand, they thought it was fascinating, obviously, but also saw the nuance in it and the satire. And I did feel that there were students in boarding school who saw it as a Bible and a how-to and a guidebook on how to fit in.
Yes, it's a strange, and it still survives. I mean, I don't know if people nowadays are aware of it, but and so in the same way with that book, there are moments in Age of Consent where I sort of perceive that ironic detachment between the narrator and the subject and the material, and other times less so. How did you sort of play that particular instrument? The irony,
zooming in, zooming out. There are certain scenes that are very intimate and I think very sad, particularly the scenes from India's point of view, being one of the most tragic characters in the book. Eve, I could deal with a little bit more levity. Her situation wasn't as dire, and Justine sort of somewhere in the middle. But I think it was important to me to have a sense of humor and have fun, as well as investigate the darker sides of the things that were going on in their lives.
Right.
So, there was a little zooming in and zooming out.
Yeah, I think I told you the other day.
It's fun to have fun. So
yeah, there are a couple lines in there where, I suddenly, realized you were poking fun a little bit in a way that it's not always that way. Because
I just can't help myself, Nick.
Yeah, you're warm to them. I am looking here at the questions are starting to pile up, and they are in 8-point type. They're very small, and I'm getting distracted by them. I'm gonna throw a couple your way in a moment, but I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you myself was, well, first of all, what's next, and what have you learned about writing in the process of doing this, which I think it was a long process, that you wish you'd known when you embarked on this one?
So Molly Johnfast, when I first told her that I was writing this book, now of course you start writing a book and you think it's going to be published next week and it's all going to be fine, and otherwise you wouldn't start probably. But she said, "This is the one thing you've ever done in your life that's going to make you happy. You're a real estate broker." And and I went out, and then she said, "Well, I mean, it's probably going to be like 10 years." And I was like, "I don't spend 10 years doing anything." So 10 years later, here I am. I think it's just, writers are not just hatched from an egg. I had to spend a long time learning how to do it.
And what did you have to shed? What were the sort of the things that you had?
Bad writing. No.
Yeah. Well.
I just had to write. I had to learn how to write a novel. I mean, the first draft I wrote was basically almost a screenplay. It was all dialogue because initially I didn't have a sort of sense of myself as an author. So I didn't have a voice as an author. And I think that's also why I started writing it as an oral history, because I didn't really think I could write a story. I could just report. So actually the first version was more like reporting. And then over time and over a million drafts, I figured out how to have more authorship. I also, as I said before, I got to know my characters so that I could paint them more accurately on the page. And it just takes a really long time and a lot of practice. It's like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Train. Yeah, it's miserable. Good on you. Good on you for finishing. So are you going to do this?
Don't recommend it to anyone.
Are you doing this again?
Yes, I'm actually. I wish I were further through the next draft. I thought that this terrible epidemic would give me the opportunity to complete my first draft of my second novel, but other things have gotten in the way. I'm sure you understand. Anyone else who's listening has probably that same experience. But I'm almost finished with the next novel, first draft. But as mentioned, many drafts are to come after that. And it's completely different. It's set in contemporary times. And it's, again, a story of women and identity and those same questions, but it's completely different.
Can I ask, who is the coke-addled mean boss art gallerist? I have a guess, but I don't think I should say so because I'm sued. She's loosely based on someone who was not coke-addled, who was a fantastic art dealer, Mary Boone. Yeah. But Mary Boone also did not have long underarm hair. And then, Massimo Sforza is a combination of Julian Schnabel and Francesco Clemente. I mean, these things are not rocket science. But it's fun. I mean, it was
fun. It was fun.
Those are the Easter eggs in a way.
Completely.
All right, I'm going to turn to the questions that are lining up here, and because they are written in such small type, some of them I can't really read until I'm already reading them, so beware. The first one that came in was, and I'm not really sure if this is how do you or how does one? You can answer this however you like. How do you write about sexuality, innocence, perhaps shattered innocence, and romance in a fresh way?
Oh, it's always interesting.
But it's so often tacky. I mean, it's kind of hard to.
I will say that one of the things I struggled over the most were the sex scenes. I mean, it is painful to write sex scenes. It's awful. Yeah. I hated every minute of it. And it's so hard not to just fall into like some 50 Shades of Grey vile kind of cliched language. It was miserable. In fact, there was this one sex scene that I really could not bear to write. And I called Deb Kopeikin, who you know also, and I said, please, can you do me a favor? Can you please write a sex scene for me? And she was like, I'm on deadline. Like, I can't do it. And then I was like, okay, fine, Amanda, you just got to do it. And when I went in to meet with Viking for the first time, they were like, you know, what we were really impressed with was you write sex scenes so well. And I was like, no, you have no idea how much I hated that. It was terrible. And there's, you know, not that much sex in the book, but what there is just, I struggled. So I don't know if it's fresh, but it was painful.
It wasn't painful to read. Well, some of it was actually. Not because of what's being depicted. Let's put it that way. It's what's being depicted. It's not how it's being depicted.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. Indira writes, also would love to hear her, you or her, talk about her essay submitted to New York Times Modern Love, but is yet unpublished, that addresses the questions about consent, how she wanted a relationship with the teacher in real life, but he ultimately rejected her. Was it because he was predatory on scholarship students, but not on someone like her?
Hi, Indira.
She's a college roommate, apparently, as I keep reading here. Yeah. So she knows more than. Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be published or not. It has been submitted to Modern Love. So I did have this flirtation with this teacher in boarding school, and it's not like the flirtation that Eve has. It's very different. But in 2017, the New York Times published on the front page this report of the years of sexual abuse that had been documented at Choate. And of course, I immediately scanned the list for his name, and there it was. And I felt so many different emotions. I mean, he never did anything to me, but he had ample opportunity. And I just felt very, I don't know, I mean, I felt relief beyond belief, but also sort of wondered why he chose certain girls and not others, and what's behind that. I mean, I don't have an answer at all, but I definitely felt, you know, he didn't make a pass at me. Why did he make a pass at those girls? And yeah, that's what the essay is about.
And this guy was in the report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With many other teachers that I had, and like
Right.
you, I mean, it's, you know, it's so depressing. In fact, our dorm master was one of the main perpetrators of abuse. And it's just, he was like Mr. Rogers to me, you know, it's just so depressing. But
how have your parents reacted to the novel, to the apparent revelations, and also to even reading a report like the Choate report and realizing what you'd been exposed to?
well, I mean, so it didn't happen to me, to be completely honest. And I was also unaware of it at the time. I mean, I think other students were more aware of it than I was. I just didn't know it was happening. And I didn't have an inkling. And I don't think that we've actually even talked about it with my parents, because it wasn't something that happened to me. And, you know, so I think in general, my parents have really enjoyed reading the book, and they think it's, I mean, they have mixed feelings, obviously.
You call them social climbers in the book. I know this.
This is a novel.
You can always, whenever it's convenient.
They're not my parents.
I understand.
My parents are actually the people who are watching the chat right now, not the people in that novel.
Right. Hi, Mom and Dad. Here's a good question from Cynthia. I'm doing first names for some reason, because it's just, you know, all those call-in radio shows from the 70s and 80s. Cynthia. And it's a two-part question. I'm going to read both parts. We're going to answer the first part first and the second part second. The first part is, I'll read them both. What experience from the 80s do you wish your children could have? What experience from the 80s do you hope your kids never have? So let's do the first one.
Cynthia.
That's a good question.
So I wish they could experience what the downtown in the 80s was like, what New York was when it was a little grittier, when there was incredible club life. I wish they could have gone to area. I mean, just where performance art was on the street, a daily part of life. And there was so much, there was a lot of poverty, obviously, and crime, but so much creativity that just is, everything's just been wiped clean now. And what I hope they never experience, I guess, going to nightclubs and going to area when I'm their mother and staying out until 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And seeing people do coke off their, credit card in the bathroom and offering it to my children.
Right. There was a lot of cocaine in the novel, of course. And
There's a lot of cocaine in the 80s.
There's intergenerational cocaine, which was scandalous, even to me, a child of that era. But I guess we all had, if we didn't have them as parents ourselves, I think most people knew a parent in that era who was, who was the one who bought booze or wanted to hang out. And sometimes we thought of that parent as the cool parent. Mm-hmm. And then looking back, maybe it's way more complicated than that. And there's something that's sort of tragic about it all.
Yep.
Do you have that experience?
There were definitely parents we considered cool, and parents who would throw parties and invite their kids to come to those parties and invite their friends, and they'd be smoking pot or doing lines, and they would offer it to their kids. And, they just wanted to share the love. And, the kids of those parents, I think, suffered greatly.
Yeah.
Because children need role models. I mean, they need actual discipline, and, it's important for you to say, I'm not your friend.
Right. Cynthia asked, did you do drugs? Who, me or you?
I didn't inhale.
Exactly. Here's a question from Martha. Did you find yourself remembering forgotten details? And this is one I had as well. Once you sort of really dug in and got into the headspace of remembering and writing, did it sort of stir up memories that you'd forgotten about, or was this basically your existing known stash of memories? Your anecdotes and the things that you would think about.
Well, I think it's an amazing question, Martha. What was fascinating to me in stirring up memories was my interviewing of people. When they would say, don't you remember when we blah, 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 I got, oh my God, I totally forgot about that. So that was extremely exciting. And not all of those memories were pleasant ones. One buries memories for a reason. But they really gave me, it was remembering things that happened. Remember when my parents came home in the middle of X, Y, or Z, and I'd totally forgotten those things. And that was sort of miraculous. I mean, the memory is so fascinating to me, how it could lie there latent for so many years in your brain. And then you just, someone says, don't you remember? And you're like, oh, of course I do. I loved that about writing this book.
Were you one of the people in your life who had or has the memories?
I think my memories are pretty intense from that time. And, but what was wonderful was for the other people that I grew up with, that I interviewed, to fill in a sort of broader tableau of memories that I did not have. And then they also told me things that for example, one of my friends couldn't go home. He didn't have the money to go home on holidays. And so he would spend the holidays in the dorm with I think the housemaster's family. And, I realized, oh, that's why he didn't go home. He didn't have the money. I didn't understand at the time, so it kind of enriched my memories and filled in blanks that were there.
Maybe it's that kids are sort of often pretty unsophisticated from a socioeconomic awareness.
Well, I certainly was. So
maybe more sophisticated now because of just being exposed to more media, more everything.
I think also, Nick, people talk about it more.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's more, first of all, it's not unacceptable in the way that it was in the 80s. It was an embarrassment, I think. And, I don't think it's necessarily, I'm sure, you know, there are exceptions, but I think it's much more in the dialogue, let's put it that way.
Sarah asks, do you keep a journal? And I'm tempted to change that question to, did you keep a journal? You can answer.
No, and no.
No, you did not keep a journal.
I take notes all the time, but I did not keep a journal. I did actually had a couple sort of notebooks from that time that were plastered with Bowie stickers, and I did go back to those, but honestly, they were so embarrassing, and they were all obsessive, you know, writings about this boy that I had a crush on, and that boy I had a crush on, and whatever, and Bowie lyrics, and it was sort of funny to read, but
You haven't thrown them out.
I didn't find them that substantive.
But did you throw them out, or have you burned them?
No, of course not.
Sure.
Those are treasures. They're embalmed in aspic. I mean, no.
Right.
They didn't. There was not a view into my psyche or anyone else's.
Here's a question from Frederick, and it's kind of a man question. Very
Maybe you should answer it, Nick.
Yeah. Have you thought about what you hope the impact of the book will be? What good is it? What good are you doing anything for anybody?
I just hope that it will, first of all, I hope it will entertain people, and I hope it will inform the continued dialogue about young women coming of age and the struggles between parents and teenagers, and how that morphs and changes throughout decades, but the core of it remains intact.
That's a good answer. You're probably going to get, you know, you gotta have a spiel for, you know.
I should be keeping a journal right now and writing things down, but.
Yes. One person named Roman asked, being a parent now, what advice would you have wanted from your parents when you were 15? What do you wish they had told you?
I'm not as stupid as you think I am. No. You know, they did that. They tried. You know, it's really hard. Like the other day, my 16-year-old daughter said, can you stop telling me about what it was like when you were a kid? Like, I'm really not, it's really sad when you're a parent to try to say, you know, I was a teenager also. You remember your own parents saying, I was a teenager also, and you're like, no, you weren't. I think that's, I don't think you're never going to break through that barrier, Roman.
And there's one last question here from Ethan. Nick, what do you wish you had asked Amanda that you didn't? It's sort of meta now.
Ethan is very meta.
Ethan, DM me. No, you know, congratulations on this, really.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for doing
I'm happy for you. Good luck out in the world.
Thank you for igniting the spark in the first place.
I have no memory of that. I'm known as, you know, I'm known as the person who often has the memories of the old days, of way back, but the recent past is elusive. But anyway.
Yeah. I think that's, yeah, we know what the word for that is.
Yeah, old age, among other things. But I wish you well. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I think you're here. I mean, I don't really see anybody. It's weird, but this is the way we live now. But anyway, thanks all, and good luck. And
thank you, Nick, and thank you, Amanda, and congratulations, Amanda.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having us.
Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.